Dr. Anthony Fauci. Is he a saint or sanctimonious scoundrel? That's today's Cosmic Reckoning. As the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases Director, Dr. Fauci had one job: to protect the nation from an infectious disease. Yet, as the COVID-19 pandemic erupted, the good doctor evolved into something much more complex and more contentious. Rather than steering clear of politics, the nation's top public health official became a political weapon to undermine the Trump presidency leading into the 2020 election. And under the Biden administration, Fauci was used to humiliate Republicans who sparred with him over policies, and eventually to confuse, divide, and shame the American people for challenging his prescriptions. So how can we objectively evaluate his remedies? Shouldn't we want to embrace the lessons learned to avoid another pandemic? So for me, there are two questions to help us think right for this examination. First, how many times would your doctor have to lie to you before you got a second opinion? And second, what would you do if, after seeking a second opinion, your primary doctor demanded you banned from social media, shamed publicly, fired from your job, and prosecuted? Even before cases exploded in the U.S., the pandemic became a political battlefield. In private, Dr. Fauci opposed President Trump's travel ban on China. Publicly, he supported it, only to later say travel bans in Europe and for Europe were irrelevant. And with that, the Democratic Party embraced the good doctor as a lightning rod to attack President Trump, calling him xenophobic and racist. And as a newly minted star, Fauci invited and even seemed to relish the challenges to his dictates.
So if you are trying to, get at me as a public health official and a scientist, you're really attacking not only Dr. Anthony Fauci, you're attacking science. Science and the truth are being attacked.
The corporate media found their god of science, but the self-proclaimed deity faltered. Under congressional scrutiny, Dr. Fauci was forced to admit that travel bans do work and that Trump's travel ban likely was effective in buying the United States time to prepare for the pandemic. And what about those face diapers, those masks? So in March of 2020, the octogenarian white coat told us there's no reason to wear a mask. But by July 2020, Fauci said masks are an important component to fight COVID. So this contradiction became a cornerstone of his narrative. You see, it's not just that his story kept changing. Dr. Fauci had no data to back it up. In a private email to a former HHS official, he said, the typical mask you buy in the drugstore is not really effective in keeping out virus, which is small enough to pass through the material. Cloth masks, which were ineffective pre-COVID, suddenly became vital to Fauci's narrative. So Dr. Vinay Prasad points out that Fauci kept changing the herd immunity threshold without any scientific data. He just made it up. When it comes to lockdowns, the nation's infectious disease director refused to hear other points of view. After a group of good faith epidemiologists suggested an alternative focus protection, Dr. Fauci labeled them as fringe. But it wasn't enough to dismiss them. He gathered his inner circle of sycophant scientists to take down the heretics. So stop to think about that. A scientist fought to silence other scientists. Again, Fauci knew better. Prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, mainstream epidemiology and public health entities doubted or even rejected the efficacy of lockdowns because they were considered ineffective. So, why did Fauci champion lockdowns? Because his ultimate agenda was to push an experimental vaccine on the nation.
The real critical question is, what do you do during the lockdown? If you have a vaccine available, you might want to lock down temporarily so you can get everybody vaccinated.
That was Dr. Fauci on lessons learned from the pandemic. President Trump famously said, the cure can't be worse than the disease.
America will again and soon be open for business. very soon, a lot sooner than 3 or 4 months that somebody was suggesting. A lot sooner. We cannot let the cure be worse than the problem itself. We're not going to let the cure be worse than the problem.
In a recent peer-reviewed study, the authors concluded that the cure of lockdowns did nothing to prevent or even slow the spread of COVID. Instead, they left a trail of devastation, crippling our economy, piling up trillions in debt, sending depression and suicide rates soaring to all-time highs. They fractured us, not just as a nation, but down to our very families, driving wedges deeper than we've ever seen in modern history. Dr. Marty Makary lost faith in Fauci when he claimed natural immunity from previous infection offers little protection compared to vaccinated immunity. Since the Athenian plague of 430 BC, it has been observed that those who recovered after infection were protected against severe disease if reinfected. That was also the observation of nearly every practicing physician during the first 18 months of the COVID pandemic. Most Americans who were fired for not having the COVID vaccine already had antibodies that effectively neutralized the virus. But they were antibodies that the government did not recognize. In other words, Fauci ignored the real-world evidence of natural immunity. By now, the American people were restless and even hostile to the feudal policies forced upon them. Desperate to subject us to their political agenda, the Biden regime imposed vaccine mandates based on the promise it could prevent infection. You're not going to get COVID if you get these vaccinations.
You're not going to get COVID if you have these vaccinations.
But as the mRNA shots rolled out, the data revealed they were ineffective at preventing infection and transmission. And yet, they persisted with the mandates. Instead of following the science, they moved the goalpost.
24-yard attempt. Oh, he hits the upright. It's no good.
And when it comes to school closures, Dr. Makary and other scientists pointed out that transmission rates were no different from European schools that remained open without mask mandates. In recent congressional testimony, Fauci could not recall a single study to justify his support for closing schools. "Don't do it," said Fauci when asked about taking ivermectin or hydroxychloroquine for COVID. Despite claiming they were doing their best with a novel virus, Fauci intentionally avoided exploring all potential treatments. The guy in charge of funding research couldn't pull a measly $1 million from the trillions we spent on the pandemic to fund a study of ivermectin or hydroxychloroquine? The NIH director had no problem endorsing Paxlovid, despite its questionable benefits and the fact that in some cases, people died. I wonder if that's because it was created by Pfizer.
And then over the next day or so, I started to feel really poorly, much worse than in the first go around.
Dr. Fauci would not be deterred from his agenda, a novel vaccine for a novel virus. He shut down other therapeutics because this virus, this pandemic, was not just a test of medical science, but a political and personal crusade. Look, you can spin Fauci's tales all you want. He consistently took the wrong positions to advance a political agenda. In no way was Fauci ever open-minded. To this day, St. Fauci is playing word games and shifting the blame. These are the actions of a sanctimonious scoundrel. But the worst offense of all is the fact that the God of science advocated for, protected, and funded the gain-of-function research that led to the creation of COVID-19. A treasure trove of documents uncovered through subpoenas, FOIA requests established that Fauci's NIAID was funding gain-of-function research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology by laundering money through EcoHealth Alliance, a scandal-plagued nonprofit. It's not enough that the lead Chinese scientist at the Wuhan lab was nicknamed the Bat Lady. Scientists from around the world have noted SARS-CoV-2 is strikingly similar to the viruses that EcoHealth was working on in 2018. In the early days of the outbreak, the Wuhan lab deleted their public server to hide any and all evidence. And now Fauci is baldly saying he can't be expected to really know all of what's going on at a lab receiving taxpayer funding. What makes the blindfolded defense of Dr. Fauci so maddening is that he already told us that COVID-19 and the millions of lives lost were justified. In 2012, the mad Dr. Fauci wrote this: "What if that scientist becomes infected with the virus, which leads to an outbreak and ultimately triggers a pandemic? As indeed I have said, that the benefits of such experiments and the resulting knowledge outweigh the risk." Dr. Fauci played God with the science. The American people were just lab rats, or should I say lab beagles, in the mad doctor's scientific crusade. So how many times does Dr. Fauci have to lie before you stop trusting him? Now that we have hundreds of millions of second opinions from experts, doctors, real-world data, new research, and our own experience, it's time to question the unwavering defense of a man who still believes he is the God of science. I'm Brian Tuttimore. That's today's Cosmic Reckoning. And remember, think right to live free.